A person I interviewed for my book, an economist, has said this brilliant thing. I've never heard anyone else say this, that a theory of change is kind of like an architect's small scale model. There are ways measurement and evaluation can be done right, and there are ways it can be done very wrong, right? Someone I knew in the audience raised their hand and they said, with all due respect, Leah, nonprofit measurement kills my soul. I love that honesty. Like it was point well taken, right? Why do we hear this so often and what needs to change to make it better?
Welcome back to part two with Leah Kral and her book, as you see right here, Innovation for Social Change. It's for nonprofits. Talk about how to innovate in your nonprofit. And it's not something we talk about much in the nonprofit sector because we think that that's for the for-profit sector. The fact is it's for us too. And we've talked about, okay, how do you get people on board with innovation? How do you kind of unleash that power? And how do you put design thinking into force? And now we're going to talk about, okay, once you've done that, how do you evaluate if this program, this new innovation is even working? And the question I have is the theory of change, that's something that all nonprofits should know about and be focused on, especially as it relates to vision and mission. And it's sometimes incorporated into a logic model, but how does it apply to innovation? How does mission, vision, and theory of change and logic model, all that, how does that work into doing innovative programs?
I think, whether we admit it or not, every single nonprofit itself is a hypothesis. It's based on some educated guesswork. We create a vision and a mission, and we're like, well, if we do these interventions or these things, then we're hoping these results will happen. It's a hypothesis, and we don't always know what's going to work. We're often building the plane while flying, and we're often finding our way in the dark, right? And we can call it a theory of change. We can call it a bet, an experiment, hypothesis. Logic models kind of do this very similar thing, kind of laying out our guesswork for we do these things, then this will happen. So it's a hypothesis for how you believe your efforts will have an impact. It's basically saying, it's kind of scientific thinking, really. It's what are the conditions or sequential actions that need to be in place for us to achieve the impact we want to achieve. And so usually with nonprofits, right, there's a founder or a group of founders who have this very heartfelt, strong sense of a social problem they want to solve and a deep personal commitment to do something about it. But usually in the early startup phase, they may not be entirely sure about how they're going to solve it, right? They're just like, we got to do something about this, right? They're trying to figure it out. A great example of that, the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, two alcoholics from different sides of the country who accidentally met and just ended, alcoholism was just wrecking their lives. They accidentally met on a business trip and just kind of in the rock bottom moments, right? Having really, really struggling. They met, had an honest conversation about their struggles with addiction, and that conversation affected them, right? And so what they stumbled onto, right? They discovered the power of one alcoholic talking to another. It's kind of accidental, but they realized they were onto something, and by repeatedly having these conversations, they were helping each other in their struggles. And so they realized they wanted to share this with others, but it would take a lot of time and experimentation for them to eventually discover their famous 12-step model or even realize that their members should be anonymous, right? They were learning by doing, making mistakes as they were doing. So when you think of, having a theory of change, right, it helps us take a far off vision. It could be maybe 10 years or more into the future. And we're saying, here's what we think will work. But now we're going to test and try and experiment to discover what works. And a person I interviewed for my book, an economist, has said this brilliant thing. I've never heard anyone else say this, that a theory of change is kind of like an architect's small scale model for building a building, right? Or a house. So by kind of breaking it all down into something small and understandable, it helps us see that big picture and is just sharing, hey, these are what our assumptions are, right? And so that's really helpful, right? That clarity.
And
And
if I could just interject, sometimes when you say theory of change, everybody thinks there is a theory of change.
uh,
And there are many theories of
Many.
change depending on
Yeah,
what you're doing, right? So it's
that's right.
whatever your organization's theory of change is, that really drives everything else.
Yes, yeah, it's a hypothesis and it's gonna look different for each one. So, this won't be exact, but, so AA might be something it's many things. Right now, they have a clear understanding of all their 12 steps. They're saying, if we help people through these 12 steps, then, right, there's going to be, probably people will be empowered to work through their addiction. In the early stages, right, they just were like, "Okay, there's this power in one alcoholic talking to another." That's our theory, right? We help people do that. We help them do what we did. They're going to learn, right? And through, years, one of their lessons they learned the hard way. They didn't know they needed to be anonymous. But one of their members was a very famous baseball player. This might have been in like the 1940s, who was part of their work. It wasn't yet called AA, who very publicly fell off the wagon. And then that was so discouraging, right? It was very public, very embarrassing, all sorts of problems cascaded. And they realized, right, oh, anonymity is probably really helpful, right? So they built that in, and now that's part of their theory of change. So sometimes it evolves, right? But I think it's so important, even in those very early stages, to state it, right? And make it
Yeah.
clear, like, this is what we think. Let's put it in writing. And now we can start, testing, poking holes, like your friend, the skeptic that we talked about in the earlier episode, right? Testing
Yeah.
feasibility. And I think that's really important.
So we have a theory of change. How does that get incorporated into perhaps a logic model where we can cycle back and find out if our theory of change really proves what we think theory of change is? My training has brought me to the logic model. Do you have any other suggestions for evaluation?
Yeah, so basically, in that whole first section of my book where I use design thinking, I've used all the different frameworks. I've used logic models, theory of change. To me, pick whatever framework works best. Every nonprofit's different, but I think just articulating what your logic is for whatever that sequential step, whatever format you want to use is fine, but just state it, right, in writing on a diagram of some kind, usually something like what your thinking is, right? So if we do this, if we do that, then we think this impact will happen, right? So like the AA example, if two alcoholics are having a sincere conversation with each other, we believe that that is, and multiple, right, conversations, our theory is that that's going to help empower each other and help each other with addiction, right? That's a theory. So just by stating it, and other nonprofits are way more complex, right? Maybe your steps are 10, and that's fine, but just write it down. And so then by having clarity about it, then you can start testing, right? But if it's not written down, then people are doing guesswork about, well, what is it we're doing, right? I've been on boards where there is not a theory of change, very confusing. No one's really quite sure how to help because we're not clear, we're not specific. So to me, then to your question, what's next? How do we test that? There's a whole field that the M&E monitoring and evaluation, people who are very good at that, right? I took a really practical approach in my book to maybe you're an all volunteer nonprofit. You can't afford a whole team of monitoring and evaluation professionals. There are ways measurement and evaluation can be done right, and there are ways it can be done very wrong. I see your wheels are turning. I know you have
Well,
thoughts on this.
as I'm sitting here, you're talking about volunteer people, and of course, even small staffs, right? It's a challenge, but it seems to me using technology like Google Docs or their Google spreadsheet, where people can share that between them and they can do inputs, they can make notes and things like that and build a logic model there, talking about the inputs, talking about what actions they took, looking at the initial outputs and then of course long-term outcomes. That is something that could be done remotely by volunteers or by staff. So that is one way you could do that, I suppose, that
Yeah.
wouldn't be as complicated.
Yes. So that board I was mentioning where there wasn't a theory of change, I volunteered. I'm like, can I please help you with this? So I use AI quite a bit. asked AI to let me tell you, I gave it a little information about the mission and what the organization was.
Sure.
Gave AI its website, and then asked it questions like, "Tell me 30 nonprofits that are similar to this, somewhat similar to this organization. What are their theories of change?" Spit out a really nice list of comparable examples. And then I asked, looking at this organization's website, what do you think their theory of change is? Give me 5 examples, right? So then I took this wonderful research, right? And then just walked the nonprofit through an exercise of here's what AI thinks. What do you think? Right. And asked a series until they were able to, now they have one. So you're right. Google Docs, AI, there's a lot of great tools to develop one. It's not rocket science.
No, it's not rocket science. And, I know everybody's afraid of AI and it's going to take jobs and it's going to take over the world and all that. But the fact is I use GPT chat a lot to do searches to whatever. Not having, because I'm an academic, if it cites something, I have to go back and make sure that that citing is correct and all that stuff. But for an initial research and for ideas, I think it's an excellent tool. I don't think you can rely on that solely. I think you also have to have human input because what I have found, and I'm an extrovert, I have found that people on your board or in your staff or your volunteers who are introverts tend to have the best ideas because they've thought about them for a long time. So, not to neglect to really draw out those people who don't traditionally contribute to the conversation because they're afraid they're going to see something wrong or they don't feel secure in their thought process or whatever, or they don't feel like anybody cares. I think we have to be careful about that because I have found that the most innovative ideas often comes for those who are the quietest in the group.
Well, speaking on behalf of my fellow introverts, thank you for saying that.
Well, I really believe that, and I think so. I think AI is a good prompt tool to take that into a meeting and say, "Here's some ideas, but let's come up with some other ideas, and let's do a process of elimination." Now that we've talked about what tools we can use and we can use, do you have other tools that you would suggest for evaluation other than the logic models?
Sure. When we think about measurement and evaluation, I was giving a talk on metrics at a conference a few months ago. And during the QA, someone I knew in the audience raised their hand and they said, with all due respect, Leah, nonprofit measurement kills my soul. I love that honesty. Like it was point well taken, right? Why do we hear this so often and what needs to change to make it better? Like I'm sure you've heard a lot of heartache in your experience, right? It's a hot topic. So there's another book I recommend to everyone on this. It's called The Tyranny of Metrics. It's about a 4-hour read. And it's all about measurement pitfalls and the things we don't want to do. The author is really cleverly uses the HBO's The Wire. So if you remember that show, right, Baltimore, kind of rough, gritty, he uses stories from The Wire, their police department, their school system, and how measurement kind of went disastrously. So it's clever, fun read. He shares a story of when the mayor's office in The Wire pressures the police to reduce major crimes by 5%, which of course then backfires and creates incentives for the police to overlook actual crimes, right? So there's a gazillion ways, right? We can go about metrics disastrously. We can measure the wrong thing, create bad incentives, collect data that doesn't guide any action whatsoever, right? And so to me, it's very important, like, say that to your staff, right? And have them tell you, right? Like, let them vent a little bit. Staff, please tell me, like, what are the things we do not want to do? What has caused you pain? Surface those things, right? And empower your staff. But one of the challenges with the tyranny of metrics, he's 100% right, right? I'm recommending his book, but he doesn't go into what metrics should be. That's where I kind of pick up in my book. And so to me, I share a lot of stories of metrics done really well, but to me, it's answering the question of how, it's just very simple. How do we know if what we're doing is working? And so if you're collecting data, does it help you answer that? Right. And so a story I really like, I mentioned LifeWorks in our first session just briefly, but so they're a nonprofit focusing on at risk youth and foster care in Austin, Texas. And this is hard work. So that they're doing okay as an organization, but they just felt like something was off and that they could be doing better. So they brought their team members together for a series of brainstorms and discussions, and they just started asking themselves those hard questions like, what is the ultimate problem we're trying to solve, right? So they're kind of getting at that theory of change. Do we have enough clarity around this? What is it that we're trying to do. And what they realized through these discussions is that all of their work should be laser focused to help each client become self sufficient. That's what they realized, right? And so it was murky before. So they got that little bit of clarity. And so then they started asking hard questions about each of their 17 programs. Do each of those programs put us on a path to achieve that goal of clients achieving self sufficiency, these young people in foster care? And what they realized was maybe not so much in every case. So many of their programs were outdated or serving other purposes or reflecting thinking from many years before. Like a lot of nonprofits just kind of grow programs like oyster beds, right? It might reflect the thinking in the moment, right? For example, they looked at their workforce training programs for the foster youth. And what they realized was their programming, such as classroom based trainings or interview practice and on the job skills training, was actually designed for professional adults rather than for young people wrestling with trauma. So the workforce training program was failing because it was actually misaligned with their clients' needs. So then next, they started looking at models of workforce development trainings in the mental health field for a better fit, and they created new programming that was trauma informed and experimented, right, within a year job retention was measurably increasing. And so they began asking those hard questions and applying that same scrutiny to all 17 of their programs, making sure that they were actually helping youth in foster care to develop self-sufficiency. So to me, that's a perfect example of, metrics. It's how do we know if what we're doing is working? Are we asking the right questions? What is our data telling us? That's just a beautiful example, right, of how metrics can act as a meaningful feedback loop and help you improve your services and ask powerful questions. To me, that's what it's all about.
It's interesting because I worked several years ago when I was in Notre Dame. I worked with a group out of Utah. Well, it was actually several groups that were putting together a consortium of nonprofits to deal with the problem of foster care children who age out of the system. And they found statistically that 60% of the children that age out of the system either end up in prostitution or sex work, or they end up as drug abusers, or they end up dead. 60% within 5 years. And so they realized this was a huge problem because they hit the age of 18 and they're out of the system and they don't have any family support. They have no transportation. They have no job. And like you said, trying to get them into the job market was a challenge. And so it's a huge problem. So I think identifying those problems and making that part of your theory of change is really important. So you did, and speaking of collaboration, because this was a collaboration, it was a tough collaboration too. Collaboration is not easy. So my experience has been even the best of intentions do not necessarily bring nonprofits together to collaborate because there are egos involved, there are boards involved, there's money involved in this. What is your approach to collaboration to help organizations innovate?
That's a great question. I think of it kind of as a two-pronged answer because I think there's collaboration within our organization, which is really important, collaboration amongst the staff and the teams. And then there's collaboration outside of our organization with, nonprofit partnerships, like what you mentioned in Utah, right? Kind of a coalition of groups. Both are very important. A book I really like, I know I mentioned a lot of books. I'm an introvert and a reader.
Well, that's great. We need to read more books. Yeah.
So Matt Ridley has a really good book out called How Innovation Works. And he's really probably writing more to the business world, but I loved his book. And he makes the case that the lone inventor or the solitary genius is a myth, and why did that myth come about? Right? He thinks that it was journalists, biographers, and inventors themselves kind of like to romanticize that
Sure.
idea of the
Yeah.
rugged
I did
individualist.
this all myself. Yes. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
struggling against all odds.
Yeah.
But in reality, the author, Matt Ridley, is making the point that in reality, innovation is a team sport. And for example, we've all heard the story of Thomas Edison, right? His invention of the light bulb. But how many people know that Edison's New Jersey company employed 200 skilled craftsmen and scientists who were collaborating on tens of thousands of experiments, resulting in hundreds of patents, right? So it's, that might be a myth, thinking that we can just go it alone. We need to collaborate, right? And to me, discoveries are far more likely to happen when we're open to the insights of others and especially doing that hard work, right, of listening to what skeptical colleagues have to say. and we're human, as you say, right? Egos, right? It's important to collaborate even with difficult personalities, and that's not much fun. It's hard when others aren't automatically swept away by our staggering genius. But having others stress test our ideas can mean that we have to set our egos aside, and because in the end, innovation it's about finding better ways of doing things, finding breakthroughs, better serving the people that our missions are meant to serve, and getting at the truth of what actually works. So to me, for a manager of a team, we can model openness and diplomacy, like the examples I shared earlier in our first session from Pixar, or the story of the Mayo Clinic night staff, right? Finding ways to help a patient get a better night's sleep. That's not going to be accidental, right? Someone's got to set that tone. And so team leaders can be, as you say, mindful of the courage it takes for someone to come forward, especially an introvert. Seniority can be really intimidating. So there's some language we can use, managers can use, and I share some of that in my book. I try to model it myself when I'm leading teams, but you can say something like, all right, team, here's my perspective on X, but I'm looking for you all to challenge my assumptions. Am I missing anything key, right? Or team, I've gathered you together. I'm looking for some hard challenges from you all, because just give me your best arguments. Help me weigh the trade offs of this. Let's hear the pros and then the cons, right? So you're just being specific, and if you're still hearing crickets, right, you can say things like, I'd rather have this idea crash and burn here with you all than to have it crash and burn with our clients. What risks or problems should we anticipate? What does the group think? Or if it's really crickets, like that example I shared earlier of the Devil Wears Prada, where you kind of make somebody else the bad guy, right? To encourage people to speak up and say, well, it's not me saying this negativity, right? It's this, we're doing a role playing, right? It's this other person. That might be what they say so there's a lot of, very simple, these ways of speaking. It doesn't cost a dime, right? It's just practices that can encourage people to speak up. And back to your question then, right? It's so helpful too, not just to collaborate within our organization, but outside of. That's kind of a personal bugbear with me. I call it silo thinking or myopic thinking, or just thinking we can solve a really complex problem all by ourselves, right? With our small budget, and social problems are more complex than that, right? We're not going to get very far without partnerships and coalitions. And so very quickly, I can just share a good story of that. Strive Together is a consortium of nonprofits that successfully achieved improvement of educational outcomes for students, at-risk students in Cincinnati, Ohio. And they brought over 300 local educational leaders, stakeholders. They were grant makers from the business world, local governments, school districts, nonprofits, right? All working together on this problem of, how do we help the at-risk young people in our community to have better educational outcomes, be first generational college students? And even though all these groups came with their different areas of expertise and maybe didn't even see eye to eye on everything with each other, but they found a way to agree on some common metrics and then work together, right? And they've had great impact. Now they've expanded beyond Cincinnati. They're doing the same model in like 70 locations across the country. So to me, that's a great example, right, of the power of collaboration and, coming together to solve problems.
Well, it certainly is difficult, but if you can bring them together, and what I found, and I've said this in other videos, is that with collaboration, there's a challenge and there's a great opportunity. The challenge is when you get these nonprofits together, the executive directors come together and when they talk about a collaboration, well, then they have to go back to their boards and sell it, right? And sometimes boards are very protective of their nonprofits. So that's one challenge that we have to be aware of. So giving executive directors or presidents or whatever their role is, the tools to take back to their boards and say, here's why it's such a good idea is great. But the other thing is that I've found from foundations and other funders, actually, donors, so on and so forth, they love collaboration because they see that their donation is being expanded by this collaboration, and they are not the only game in town. And so if you can get two or three foundations involved and say, look, we're six nonprofits that are collaborating on this idea, and this is what we want the funding for. Donors and foundations tend to really like that because they don't like it when organizations duplicate services, and they love it when organizations work together.
Yeah, yeah, bravo to the funders who are doing that. I had mentioned in our first segment about the creation of the 911 emergency system. It was the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation was kind of the leader in that. And so when they did their calls for proposals, they said, only come to us if you are building a coalition approach to solving this problem. Submit a grant, but show us, right, who you're partnering with. And I'm seeing more of that, which I think is very wise because, yeah, social problems are just too complex for one nonprofit alone.
Well, great. Well, we've talked about, selling this to donors and foundations, and I think this ends part 2, and we're about to go into part 3. And that is going to be about bringing your A game and how do we make these innovations appeal to donors and others who are stakeholders in this. So hold on to your seats. We're going to tie it up with part 3. And for part 3, just go right here and we'll be right back.